anyway, we will move on from that before it all gets controversial. And we will talk about something even more controversial, which is airport slots and the ongoing furor over something that on the surface seems quite boring, but actually is quite interesting and has big ramifications. I will do a quick recap. You know when you get those TV shows and it's like, last episode.
Previously on the Australian Aviation Podcast.
Exactly. That was very good.
I know.
So let's talk through airport slots. So a slot is a literal takeoff slot. And obviously, you can only have so many aircraft on a runway taking off at one time. So these things are quite precious. As you would imagine, some slots are better than others. So you want to have the peak times. The system that we have in Australia and in many countries around the world for working out who gets those slots, it basically is that if you have a slot, you can keep it forever as long as you fly it 80% of the time. Now, the reason for that is basically to encourage competition, but also to give airlines a little bit of leeway if they need to cancel a flight for a legitimate reason. However, the problem with this is it allows them to cancel up to 1/5 of their flights and still keep this monopoly on the best times forever. Now, this is a problem kind of globally, but it's particularly a problem in Sydney, where obviously we at the moment have just one airport for this huge city, or in fact one big airport for the whole state. And we have this new situation where we've got two new players in Bonza and Rex trying to take on Virgin and Qantas, and they are now struggling to get hold of these plum positions. Now, this also coincides with our kind of post-COVID recovery. What we are seeing in a kind of flip of this time last year is that while the international aviation is kind of actually recovering pretty well and much better than we expected from COVID, domestic aviation is stagnating. So we're at kind of 90%, 92, 93% of those 2019 figures, and we're struggling to get back to where we are before. And so a lot of people are basically saying these slot rules are hampering our recovery. That was a long prelude before we get to the story. But essentially, Sydney Airport have seen little growth in the last month. And Sydney Airport CEO has said, to quote the headline Jake wrote, "Use your slots or give them up."
Yeah.
Jake, tell us more.
Yeah, this is probably Geoff Culbert, the outgoing CEO of Sydney Airport. This is probably his strongest intervention yet. He said that the airlines are largely to blame for the lagging domestic recovery at Sydney. Passenger numbers grew only 1.2% year on year. So that was 1.90 million domestic travellers in June. That is a 90.6% recovery rate on June 2019. Contrast this to a 66.7% year-on-year jump in international traffic. 1.16 million people went through the international terminal at Sydney in June. That's an 88.8% recovery rate on June 2019. It's sort of trending towards the international recovery overtaking the domestic recovery because it's almost caught up. And basically what Geoff Culbert has said is these steep airfares and the high cancellation rates on popular domestic routes are suppressing domestic passenger demand. He says, quote, "In the 12 months to June, passenger numbers on the Sydney to Melbourne route were just 81% recovered compared to pre-pandemic levels, while numbers between Sydney and Canberra were only 64% recovered. It will be interesting to see if this is a long-term trend. If incumbent airlines have decided to fly less between key domestic markets, then they should relinquish slots to domestic and international carriers who want to operate out of Sydney Airport and provide more choice for customers." So that was a direct quote there from Geoff Culbert in a press release.
One of the extraordinary things about this is Sydney actually are not in charge of the rules. This is essentially a kind of a government mandate, but obviously they sort of have to enforce them. Now, both Qantas and Virgin will say very loudly that they're not in any way trying to game the system. And the reason we particularly have issues at Sydney is through what Virgin called the complexities of flying at Sydney. And that is that it's particularly vulnerable to bad weather, that obviously it's kind of full to bursting. But it's quite, and then everyone's choosing their words carefully. They're saying there's no issue here. But then you've got Sydney Airport itself turn round and say you need to give your slots up. Like they're saying this isn't good.
Yeah, and it's probably impacting a bit on the situation that Geoff Culbert is retiring. So he may be finally deciding that hang it all, I'll say what I like. But it is true that Sydney Airport has long been opposed to keeping this current 80-20 slot system. Which has, been pointed out by airlines such as Rex and Bonza, in particular, as being, a real hamper on growth. Ironically, of course, it was John Sharp, the deputy chairman of Rex, who implemented the 80-20 rule when he was in government as a minister. But he has now said that was a mistake. He'd want the ratio to sort of be skewed less in favor of the airlines. And I mean, it does complicate matters as well that Sydney is, not just a domestic airport. It's an international airport. You've got all these. It's Australia's major gateway. It's the main way that international passengers enter the country. And so to have all of these, it is, as you said, Adam, full to bursting. And so all of these prime time slots are in very high demand. There's just not a lot of real estate. And of course, as you said again, these in situations where there's high winds or bad weather of any kind, like we've seen recently, there's been a number of instances in the past few weeks where Sydney Airport has gone down to single runway operations because there have been high winds that have forced one of the runways to close. And when there's only one runway running, flights get cancelled. It's interesting because I say the big airlines are saying we're not doing anything dodgy at all. This isn't the case. You've got Sydney that are not Sydney Airport that are not accusing anybody necessarily of gaming the system, but they are saying if you can't use these slots, give them up. You've got the ACCC, which is probably the most significant intervention that they said, and they chose their words carefully, and they said the system can be exploited. So they seem to be suggesting that this rule is wrong. One of the things that we had kind of coincidentally happened that it was on Friday last week, BITRA, which is basically the kind of department of the Department of Transport that deals with aviation statistics, released a lot of the information for the kind of the cancellations and the delays that we saw last month. So one of the things I did was to go back 6 months and see how many cancellations we've had on the Sydney to Melbourne and Melbourne to Sydney route, and then to compare that to what we saw last year, and then to compare that to what we saw in 2019. So across those 6 months, we had 2,300 flights between Sydney and Melbourne were cancelled, and that compares to the 1,700 in pre-pandemic 2019. So you've got to imagine that there were probably more flights and more people flying as well. So that's actually quite an enormous increase. Obviously, you would assume that of those 2,000 flights, the majority of people that were booked on them would have been thrown onto the next flight or would somehow have got to their destination. So that leads to the question is, why were these 2,300 flights cancelled? Now, yes, you will have problems with weather and etc. But at the same time, it is extraordinary that on one route in just 6 months, 2,300 flights are cancelled. That is a gobsmacking number. I'll bring you here, on this, Chris. What do you think? Because I saw that and I was totting it up and I'm like, that is a lot. It should be the case that a cancellation is a very rare thing. But what this shows us is actually an incredibly common occurrence. Yeah, look, it's airlines never want to cancel a flight. And speaking from a crew point of view, when I was crew, we don't step on board at the start of the day going, how can we F with the passengers today? I know, let's cancel a flight. The crew not with that attitude, Chris.
No, not with that attitude at all. So the crew definitely want the aircraft to take off. what would be interesting to note, does the Bitra report break it down to reason of cancellation?
This is one of the interesting things, and if somebody listening can help with this, let me know. What I want to know is if or when a flight is cancelled, does somebody have to record the reason for that? Is there somebody that's responsible? Is that even a thing? At the moment, all we know is a flight gets cancelled. And obviously the complexity of this is sometimes it will be a number of factors that cause something to happen. Sometimes it might be that something happens that leads to something else happening that leads to the flight not taking off. And obviously, as we've spoken about before on the show, it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. Everything kind of affects everything else. So it's not necessarily the case that somebody would have written down, we couldn't be bothered, we cancelled it. Or,
Planes haunted.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily that easy. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why everyone is choosing their words very carefully when they're making kind of accusations, and also why the big airlines are being quite steadfast in their defence. Yeah. But nonetheless, I find that figure gobsmacking.
Yeah, look, the figure is huge, and I would have a safe guess, safety first priority, of course. If it's not safe to operate the flight, don't go ahead. There would certainly be, given the recent delays that we've seen out of Sydney with the weather and the wind, there would be some delays attributed to weather. I would hate to think that flights were cancelled because they didn't have enough passengers or bums on seats. It has happened in the past that airlines have been known to cancel a flight because there's not enough passengers, so it's easier to fill up one flight than operate two half-empty flights. But
the cancellation rate for the last month between Sydney and Melbourne is 8.9%. That's enormous.
That's huge.
That is huge. And that compares to the kind of long-term nationwide underlying number of 2.1%. The idea that almost 1 in 10 flights are getting cancelled seems to me an extraordinary blowout.
Yeah, look, I think if you ask the airlines, the big players, they will put it down to staffing issues right now. That seems to be the go-to reason for most things at the moment. Oh, we don't have enough staff. But look, I think it's not acceptable. Australia deserves better. Our travelling public deserve better. We've had better. And if everyone's skirting around the issue, there's clearly an issue. So I'd like to know who's putting their hand up to be the first one to say, let's change it.
Now, thinking about it, I think of all the reasons that your flight could be cancelled, I think planes haunted would probably be the best. I wouldn't mind.
But if a plane was haunted, wouldn't that mean that somebody would have had to have died on that plane?
Not necessarily. Could have been a wandering ghost who just decided to take up residence on the plane. Could happen.
There is a very old story of, and I totally digress here. There's an old story of an aircraft that unfortunately went down in the US many, many years ago. I believe it was the 70s or the 80s. Some of the parts of that aircraft were usable. So things like galley carts and Atlas boxes where they're in the crew galley and they store things that the crew may need. So the parts that were deemed safe to be reused were cleaned up and reused on another aircraft.
I don't believe that. No, I don't believe this. No.
Now, the crew of the aircraft that these particular parts went onto said that the aircraft became haunted and they felt the presence of the captain, who unfortunately was lost in the original plane crash.
I just find it very hard to believe that there's a plane crash. Presumably, people had died, and then the air traffic investigators or what are going through that very emotional scene. So they're like, oh, that cart, that drinks cart, like that works perfectly fine. Let's keep that.
Money to an airline.
Bing boom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Avenge me!
On that note, we're going to go for a break. We'll be back in a minute.